Now, Turkey has intensified its crackdown on anti-government protests with more detentions, including the lawyer of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem Imamoglu. It was the mayor's arrest last week that sparked the wave of unrest. The demonstrations are the largest in the country in more than a decade, with protesters demanding the release of Imamoglu. Police have detained some 2,000 demonstrators in the past days. And Turkish authorities have also deported the BBC journalist Mark Lowen, seen here covering the protests in Istanbul prior to his 17-hour detention and deportation. And we can speak to the BBC's Mark Lowen now. He's joining us from the BBC headquarters in London. Welcome to you, Mark. Describe to us how your detention came about. What happened?
Well, I'd been in Istanbul since last Sunday, returning to Istanbul, I have to say, because I was the BBC Turkey correspondent for 5 years between 2014 and 2019. So it's a country I know well. I speak the language to a reasonable degree. And I went back last Sunday to begin reporting on the protests. And then on Wednesday, I was in my hotel room and the phone in the hotel room rang, and it was the reception of the hotel. And the receptionist said, "Mr. Lowen, we have an important matter to discuss with you in person. Could you please come down?" So I arrived in reception to find 3 plainclothes police officers there who asked me to take my passport, and they whisked me off to the police headquarters in Istanbul. I was held there initially for 7 hours, and I was allowed to have a couple of colleagues present from the BBC. And the atmosphere was pretty cordial there. A couple of them were saying that they did not agree with this, that it was the state that was deciding this, and that they believed I should be free. One even hugged me at the end and said, "You're a good man, we'd like you to be free." And then after 7 hours, at about 9:30 at night, my 2 colleagues were asked to leave, and I was taken to the second of the 3 custody centres where I was held, which was the foreigners custody department of the Istanbul police. And I was held there for about 5 hours and fingerprinted, and the attitude hardened there of police officers. And then I was presented at 2:30 in the morning with papers that said I was being deported because I was, quote, a threat to public order. When I asked what that meant, they said this was just a decision by the government. They couldn't give me any more. And then I was taken to the final location, which was the foreign custody department at Istanbul airport, and held for a further 5 hours there before being put on a deportation flight, Turkish Airlines flight to London at 8 a.m.
So, Mark, when you say the attitude hardened, in general, how were you treated while you were being held in custody?
I was not mistreated at all. I was not physically mistreated, and they spoke to me with a certain level of respect and kind of, and in a perfectly acceptable way. But they were, for example, they didn't allow me for the last 10 hours. I had no access to my phone, to lawyers, to the outside world. And when I protested that, a couple of them got quite sort of frustrated, and then they held me in one individual prefabricated sort of shipping container type facility. They didn't deny me food or water when I needed it. And I have to say that I had, the full backing of the BBC behind me, which was working behind the scenes with the British consulate as well in Istanbul to remain completely informed and to put pressure on the Turkish authorities. Even though it was a fairly unpleasant experience, a distressing experience in that way, to be held and deported from a country that I know well and I have a lot of affection for, it was nothing compared to the experience of so many others, journalists and those in other sectors of society. I mean, since the protests began 10 days ago almost, 11 journalists have been detained. When I lived in Turkey, during those years, Turkey was the world's biggest jailer of journalists. It ranks near the bottom in the Press Freedom Index around the world. And I got sort of a sort of first-hand glimpse of that clamour for democracy and clamour against the crackdown on the media, which is one of the things that is driving these protests.
Right. I mean, let's talk about these ongoing protests. Obviously, these were kicked off by the arrest of the Istanbul mayor. Tell us how significant you think this protest movement has become and what it means for the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
It's the largest street protest movement in over a decade, since the 2013 Gezi Park anti-government protests, which I covered back then. The Turkish government is standing firm at the moment. President Erdogan has denounced the protesters as evil and carrying out, in his words, street terrorism. President Erdogan has been in power for 22 years, both as prime minister and president. He is at the moment emboldened by a global climate that has put Donald Trump in the White House, somebody who called for his own political rival, Hillary Clinton, to be locked up and who shows little concern for rising autocracy in countries around the world. And also the fact that Turkey is a vital country on the world stage in a sort of multipolar world. Turkey is one of those poles. It is hugely important to Ukraine at the moment, to Syria, to migration, as always. And so the international criticism of the government's clampdown on the protesters, the peaceful protesters, has been quite muted. So he will be quite emboldened by that. However, within the country, even though he has overcome and crushed so many challenges in his 22 years, there is a growing feeling of that the opposition is uniting, that even more conservative, pious Turks who are his support base are beginning to turn against him because of the state of the economy. When I moved to Turkey in 2014, it was 2 Turkish lira to the dollar. It is now close to 40 Turkish lira to the dollar. Inflation has fallen off a cliff. And the stifling of democracy has only increased. And that, I think, has very much fueled the protest movement. The question now is whether this protest movement can continue and build momentum into something bigger. The one pillar of Turkish democracy that still exists is free and fair elections, relatively free and fair elections. And that, polls say, when they come, would be won by Ekrem Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul. And so his supporters say this is a political move to detain him. President Erdogan denies that. The government denies that. But the question is whether Imamoglu can be released before an election, whether he can stand in a future election. And if he can't, whether the opposition would unite around somebody else who is allowed to stand, or whether they simply boycott it and Turkey slides further into authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Gezi Park protests back in 2013, which you also reported on at the time. And you're saying that now what's different is the opposition is uniting. What have you been hearing from people? What is different for the people this time round that's giving them the courage to keep these protests going?
In 2013, it was a street movement that did not have political backing because there was a lot of opposition to the CHP, which is Imamoglu's party. Now it is the CHP which called these protests at the start, and they kind of rallied around this figure of Ekrem Imamoglu, who is 20 years younger than President Erdogan. He's charismatic. I spoke to him, I interviewed him in 2019. He's from a secular party, but has managed to reach out to religious Turks as well. Mm-hmm. So there is a political backing to the protest this time. That, plus the fact that simply after 22 years, people are feeling the state of the economy in their pockets. And, Turkey's clamp down on democracy has been so dramatic, particularly after the failed coup of 2016, that
Mark
I think
Lowen,
it is just a matter of...
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to bring this to an end because we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank you so much. It's really great to talk to you and we wish you all the best. That's the BBC's Mark Lowen.